When my mother passed away, I had to attend her funeral accompanied by my husband Ricardo and our children. Our relationship was never easy. From an early age, our relationship was marked by her rigid temperament. Although we never suffered physical violence, her words were often harsh and critical, especially when something displeased her. I don't remember a single demonstration of affection from her. However, what really drove us apart was not only her attitudes, but the strange choices she made in the last years of her life. My mother began to get involved with people who participated in esoteric rituals associated with groups of occult practices. The house where we lived became a heavy environment, with unexplained events, noises in the middle of the night, shadows moving through the rooms. That's when I decided to leave there, taking my family with me. My sister Anna also left the house shortly after. Since then, I have cut off contact with my mother, mainly to protect my children from that disturbing energy. It all started when Anna called me to tell me about our mother's death. Her body had been found by a friend, already lifeless, on the living room couch. The doctors diagnosed a heart attack as the cause of death. That same day, I went to the funeral home to take care of the necessary paperwork, while Anna quickly returned home, as she had a small baby. I remained alone in the reception area, filling out the paperwork, when I clearly heard my mother's voice calling my name. For a few seconds, I thought it was just my imagination, but the voice rang out again, clear and unmistakable. "Clara, I'm here." I stood up, a chill running down my spine, paralyzing me, but I followed the sound coming from a narrow hallway. It was full of rooms, some open, revealing coffins. The voice seemed to guide me to the last door, marked with a restricted access sign. Curiosity, or perhaps fear, led me to open that door. Using the flashlight on my cell phone, I saw my mother lying on a stretcher, her eyes open, her expression blank. I was horrified. I had never seen a dead body before, much less my own mother's. When I turned around, I heard the creak of the gurney. When I shone the flashlight back, my mother was sitting there, staring at me. Trembling, I backed away slowly, but as soon as I got out, I started running, my heart racing. The girl at the reception saw me and asked if I was okay. I couldn't tell her what had happened. I just said that I was emotionally shaken by my mother's death. The next day, we went back to the funeral home for the wake. My oldest son went out to make the phone calls, leaving my daughter Marina alone in the room where the coffin was. When I went in, she was talking to herself, laughing. I asked her what she was doing, and Marina replied, "Grandma doesn't want me to leave." "We're talking." I tried to get her out of there, but she resisted, saying that her grandmother wanted to take her with her. I was furious and shouted that it was impossible, because her grandmother was dead. She ran out crying into Ricardo's arms, who tried to calm her down. I went back to the room and began to pray for my mother, asking her to find peace. Suddenly the candles around the coffin went out. The room went into total darkness, and I felt a shiver run through me. I tried to leave, but the door was locked. It was then that I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there she was, my mother, or something that seemed to be her, saying, "I'll come back for Marina. She no longer belongs to you." I fainted and woke up in the hospital. Desperate, I asked for my daughter, but they said she was at the funeral home with my son and his brother-in-law. I ripped out the wires that connected me to the machines and ran to the car. When I got there, I started looking frantically for Marina. When I found her, she was crying in a corner, saying that her grandmother was behind me. I turned on the flashlight on my cell phone, and there was the shadow of my mother, smiling. I grabbed my daughter and ran, but my mother seemed to be getting closer. Finally, an employee arrived and turned on the light, but the fear remained. Later, my sister called to say that our mother's body had reappeared in the coffin, charred. They never found out what happened at that funeral home, but I knew that something very evil was behind it all. Since then, we have moved on with our lives, protecting our daughter and asking for spiritual protection. I pray every day that my mother finds peace and that no evil will ever befall us again. If you are enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let's move on to the next story.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to share an experience anonymously, and I hope I won't be judged for what I'm going to tell you. For a period of time in my life, I worked as an embalmer at a well-known funeral home in the city where I lived. From the beginning, I was warned that the work was intense, since the team consisted of only 2 people to handle all the procedures. My colleague, who had been with the company for a longer time, mentioned that many embalmers who worked there were unable to stay on the job. She said that the environment was marked by unexplained events that scared even the most experienced. Many preferred to leave without even receiving their final pay. She reported that during the nights of work, while they were finishing the preparation of a body, they would hear strange noises coming from the hallway. Sometimes it sounded like something was slowly dragging itself across the floor, and often murmurs coming from the bathrooms would break the silence, even though everything was empty. At first, I listened to these stories with skepticism. I have always been a practical and rational person, trained to approach work in a scientific manner. I did not believe in spirits, demons, or anything supernatural, but everything changed one afternoon that will remain etched in my memory. It was my day off, but I received a call asking me to go to the funeral home as there was a lot of work. Despite not wanting to, I accepted. When I arrived, the place was busy due to a large funeral that would last until the evening. As soon as I entered, I noticed a young woman sitting on one of the benches at the entrance. Something about her caught my attention. She was watching me with a slight smile on her lips. I smiled politely back and went on my way. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, and when I came out, there she was again, now standing, leaning against a wall near the hallway, still looking at me and smiling. Once again, I smiled back and continued towards the room where the bodies were being prepared. When I entered the room, I saw my colleague finishing the preparations for a body. She was sitting, covering the deceased's face with a cloth. I greeted her, and as usual, we started exchanging jokes about me being called in on my day off. During the conversation, she made a playful comment about the makeup on her body. It was then that I looked at the deceased's face and was completely stunned. It was the same face as the young woman who had greeted me with a smile when I arrived. I remained silent, trying to understand what was happening. My colleague noticed my expression and asked, now worried, what was wrong. Without hesitation, I told her what I had seen. I expected her to laugh or say that it was all in my head, but her answer left me even more disturbed. She said that she had been in similar situations before. On one occasion, she was alone in the funeral home, preparing the body of an elderly man. It was a quiet night, with no funerals scheduled. While she was working, she clearly heard a male voice outside the room, repeating several times, in a trembling and almost tearful tone, "Where am I?" She went out to check, thinking that someone had entered the building, but found nothing. Returning to work, she was shocked to notice that the body's eyes were open. Frightened but calm, she carefully closed the deceased's eyes and began to talk to him, asking him to rest in peace. After that, nothing strange happened, but she was convinced that the man's spirit was lost, without realizing that he had already passed away. When I asked if the young woman I saw could be the soul of that girl, my colleague replied that it was likely, but she found it curious that she smiled, while most of the spirits that appeared there seemed confused or sad. While we were talking, something unexpected happened. The girl's body spasmed. Although we knew that this type of reaction is common in corpses due to muscular rigidity, the situation was terrifying because it happened just as we were talking about it. Silence filled the room, and we both felt a tension in the air. These unexplained events and the stories shared by other colleagues completely changed my perception of what can exist beyond death. I still carry a mixture of fascination and fear for the things I saw in that environment. A few years ago, I worked as a janitor at a funeral home. It was not easy to adapt to the environment, as being constantly surrounded by deceased people and grieving family members created a generally gloomy and depressing atmosphere. It was necessary to keep a strong mind to deal with these situations without getting carried away by the emotional aspect. One night, the body of a 5-year-old girl arrived, and I was informed because I and a colleague had been asked to carry the small coffin to the preparation room. The news shook me deeply, as I also had a small daughter. However, I limited myself to doing my job, trying to remain detached from the emotional impact, since this type of service requires a cool head. That night I stayed at the funeral home to clean and prepare the room where the girl would be laid to rest the next day. Besides me, only the woman in charge of preparing the bodies was there. It was after 11 at night, and I wanted to finish quickly so I could go home to be with my wife and daughter. While I was cleaning the bathrooms, I heard footsteps entering the room. Since I was in one of the cubicles, I didn't see who it was, but I assumed it was my colleague, since we were the only ones in the building. I asked if I needed to use the bathroom, but got no answer. When I left, I realized that there was no one there. I looked under the doors of the other cubicles, and in the last one, I saw the feet of a small girl wearing little shoes and socks. I didn't say anything, but quickly left and went to where the woman was working. When I got there, I knocked on the door of the preparation room and asked if she could come out for a moment. She came right over, asking if I needed anything. I asked if she had a daughter or if she knew who the girl I saw in the bathroom might be. She looked at me in surprise and said that she didn't have any children and that all the employees had left over an hour ago. She also said that there were only the two of us left. The woman asked if I was sure about what I had seen, and I confirmed that I was. She suggested that we go check. We went back to the women's bathroom, where I pointed out the cubicle where I had seen the little feet. When she opened the door, there was no one there. We checked the entire funeral home for the girl, but we didn't find any sign of anyone else. My colleague went back to work, asking me to call her if I saw anything again, while I tried to continue with my tasks. However, I couldn't get the image I had seen out of my head. I was convinced that it had been real. Before leaving, my colleague said goodbye, saying, "See you tomorrow, Mr. Jose. Don't stay too late. You need to rest." Her words seemed to convey a slight suspicion about what I had told her, suggesting that perhaps she was tired. I simply replied, "Good night," and went to clean the room where the deceased are laid to rest. It was my last task before going home. Everything seemed normal until I heard a child crying from somewhere. I left the room and realized that the sound seemed to be echoing from the room where the bodies are prepared for the wake. Approaching slowly, I called for someone, but there was no answer. The crying continued, now more clearly. The image of the little feet in the bathroom came back to me, and something told me that I needed to find out what was happening. I opened the door to the room carefully, but as soon as I entered, the sound stopped. The room was completely silent. The only coffin present was the girl's, closed with the body inside. I closed the door, and at the same moment the crying started again, this time more intense, almost desperate. The sound was undoubtedly coming from that room. I didn't have the courage to open the door again. A feeling of dread overcame me. I gathered my things, turned off the lights, and left the funeral home, still hearing the distant sound of crying as I locked the building. On the way home, a deep feeling of sadness consumed me. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. The next day, when I returned to work, I saw that the child's wake had already started. Her parents were next to the coffin, crying intensely. Before they left for the cemetery, I heard the mother begging to accompany her daughter. She said that the little girl had always been afraid of the dark and had never liked being alone at night. The hearse driver let her go along and everyone left. At that moment, everything made sense to me. The little girl didn't want to be alone that night, not even in the dark, and her incessant crying seemed like a cry for help. This episode shook me deeply. I told my wife, who suggested that I quit. According to her, that job was affecting my emotions and preventing me from sleeping well. After thinking about it for a few days, I followed her advice and asked to leave. However, the image of that little girl and the sound of her crying still remain vivid in my memory, reminding me that there are things that we may never be able to explain.